Thank you everyone for being here today. I just wanted to give a brief introduction to Abby, as well as to do a little plug for our affinity group, which is sponsoring the CLE. So I am Alexandra Morgan Kurt, they managing attorney for the Pennsylvania Institutional Law Project and one of the co-chairs for PLAN's LGBTQ affinity group. This affinity group is composed of staff members from all of the PLAN organizations who self-identify as members of the LGBTQ community. And we are endeavoring to create both a safe community for all of our members to vent about things going on and to find ways to advocate for the issues that are central to our lives in the community. And one thing that we really wanted to do was to have this CLE today to start to educate others on ways to improve the lives of the clients and other legal professionals they work with. So a brief bio on Abby. They are a staff attorney at Southwestern PA Legal Aid, focusing their work in Social Security and family law. They also serve as the newly appointed DEIB liaison for Southwestern PA Legal Aid to PLAN. They self-identify as queer, non-binary, and transgender. I'll also say that I have had the absolute pleasure of knowing Abby since they were a legal intern at CJP many years ago. And it has been great to watch their career flourish and the advocate they've become. So I'm excited for this webinar and I hope the rest of you enjoy it as well. Go ahead, Abby.
Thank you, Alexandra. So yeah, we're going to get started today. We'll get into the nitty-gritty of the legal practice tools that I'm going to provide you, but also since it is Pride Month, I thought that I would also give a short intro to our history of Pride. So the history of Pride began in 1969 at the Stonewall Inn. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the history of this, but the Stonewall Inn was a historic bar in Greenwich Village on Christopher Street in New York City. At the time that it was operating, it did not have a liquor license because it was illegal to serve alcohol to a gay person in the state of New York at the time. And homosexuality, which is in quotes, and we'll get into why later, was still considered a criminal offense at that time. Transgender and non-conforming expression at that time was also considered illegal. It was illegal to wear fewer than 3 items of gender inappropriate clothing. And so the laws in New York and broadly across the United States in the 60s were targeted towards queer people, but specifically gender non-conforming, trans folk, and drag queens. And that was a safe space and one of the, biggest places for people in the New York community to go was Stonewall Inn. So on the evening of June 28th, 1969, plainclothes police officers from the NYPD raided the Stonewall Inn and forcibly removed the patrons and employees into the street and barricaded themselves into the bar. And this led to a lot of rioting and uprising, as it's known now, on Christopher Street between the LGBTQ plus community and police over the brutality and oppression of the queer and trans community at the time. And these are just some photos of people that we'll get into are the leaders of the gay liberation movement, as it was known at the time, and the foremothers of the LGBTQ plus liberation movement as we know it today. So prominent figures were Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, and they were leaders of the Stonewall Uprising, and they were also considered leaders of the gay liberation movement throughout the 60s, 70s, until their deaths. One legend has Marsha P. Johnson throwing the first shot glass heard around the world, known as the beginning of the Stonewall Uprising. And another has her throwing the first brick. We don't obviously know exactly what occurred that sparked this lore, but we do know that Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera were arrested that night, as well as numerous other people involved in what became the beginning of the Pride movement. Some history as well on what occurred after that is a year later, on June 28th, 1970, Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, and other leaders of the Christopher Street Liberation Day Committee planned the first Pride Parade and week to commemorate the Christopher Street uprisings that had occurred the summer before, and to demonstrate against the centuries of abuse from government hostility to employment and housing discrimination of queer and trans folk, the control of the mafia at that time of gay bars, and anti-gay and trans laws at the time. And after the first Pride Parade and week in New York City, Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera also started the group Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, providing housing to homeless, queer, and transgender youth, with a focus obviously on the Black and Latina communities who were facing, the most vulnerable conditions in our communities for youth. And it became the first LGBTQ+ youth shelter in North America. So some quotes and photos of Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson and what had occurred at Stonewall. And Pride commemorates the work of Black and brown trans women, drag queens, and other gender nonconforming activists of color who paved the way for queer and trans liberation. I think there's a lot of focus today around consumerism and corporate capitalism kind of invading Pride, but I think bringing it back to the remembrance of Pride being a protest of police brutality, not only towards the queer community, but its interaction with white supremacy. And I think considering today is the day after our national observance of Juneteenth, I'd especially like to call in all white Plan members to consider the pervasiveness of white supremacy in our court systems, our governments, and our organizations, and hope that we all used yesterday to deeply consider this nation's treatment of Black people, to donate to Black organizations, give mutual aid and direct service to Black communities, not only on Juneteenth, but throughout the year. And that being said, for myself and others that are white, queer, and trans members of the community, that Pride Month does not absolve us from aiding in the work of Black liberation. In fact, the history of Pride is certainly a call to action that white supremacy interacts with all forms of oppression, and is at the and Black liberation is at the forefront of our mission as Plan for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So getting into why we're here today. So discussing the professional rule of responsibility 8.4G that prohibits the discrimination in the practice of law. So this law, or this rule of court, was amended on June 8th, 2020 to adopt the Pennsylvania Rules of Professional Conduct to prohibit attorneys from manifesting bias or prejudice or engaging in discrimination or harassment in the practice of law on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, race, and ethnicity, and multiple other protected classes. This presentation will be specifically focusing on sexual orientation and gender identity. But as I just said, it's important that we remember to bring into our practice, an intersectional lens of oppression and how we are uplifting marginalized communities. But specifically, I'll be focusing on the LGBTQ+ community today. So one of the first things that we can do as legal professionals is to take an inventory and a stock of what we bring to our practice through our lived experiences, right? We all have an unconscious bias that come from the socialization that we received as children, as adults, and the communities in which we have to interact with and continue to be a part of. So we have beliefs, prejudices, gaps in knowledge surrounding the issues, specifically in today's topics of sexual orientation and gender identity. To the best of our ability, maybe our personal beliefs are progressive and are positive, but sometimes we all make mistakes and slip up. So to remember that above all, you owe a professional duty of care to your LGBTQ clients, and also you owe a professional courtesy to other people in the LGBTQ community that you might work with, that might be members of the bar, or other people in our community that we come to meet through this work. And cultural competency in LGBTQ issues means not only having an understanding of the terms that we'll use. I know sometimes LGBTQ plus issues are referred to as an alphabet soup, but it's important to recognize that all of the terms that we will learn today are important to the queer and trans community, are important for you to know and try to grasp, a rudimentary understanding of, so that you can better serve our clients and our communities. But also to consider how gender identity and sexual orientation interplay with how your clients might feel in certain situations, right? The work that we do can be very traumatizing. It can force our clients to recall very difficult situations, and also to be afraid of the ramifications and the discrimination that they might experience from the court system, that they have historically received from other people or other lawyers. So to consider that your clients' choices are not necessarily of their own volition, but are to protect themselves, and we'll get into that. So one of the first things that we can do as legal professionals is to not assume that everyone that we're interacting with in the courtroom, in our offices, are heterosexual or straight, right? I think that's pretty basic, but it's something really to consider, that heteronormativity is pervasive in our culture. Many queer and trans people won't come out to you, and that's okay. You don't always know what people's identities are. Certainly for myself, I know, and a lot of the things I might say today are a reflection of me and my experiences and the experiences of other people I know, but they're not a representation, of everyone's experience all the time. But not all queer and trans people feel safe in all situations to reveal themselves, right? There might be certain courtrooms where I know that I'm safe. I know that it's safe to tell people my pronouns. I know that it's safe to talk about, my gender identity and my sexuality, but there are some courtrooms or some, places and people that I don't feel comfortable doing that with. And your clients and other lawyers and judges all face that same thing, right? That not every place is a safe place, and we may carefully hide our identities to protect ourselves. And don't assume that you can identify queer and trans people, LGBTQ plus people, based on the way they dress, based on the way they speak, based on any mannerisms or characteristics that you think might be stereotypical of the community, right? It's not a monolith, speaking for any kind of marginalized community. We don't all share the same qualities. Avoid the assumption, again, that all LGBTQ plus people are the same, or that they even share a sense of community, right? I think Pride is definitely a month where the queer and trans community can come together and celebrate and remember the importance of liberation for people, but it doesn't mean that we all have the same experiences, or that we all necessarily want to be included in other groups. So that is important to consider as well. So getting into some definitions, assigned sex is kind of an outdated term even at this point. you know, I think we've come to the point where assigned sex, you know, and gender reveals and things of that nature are just based on what doctors and parents are perceiving about a child at birth, right? What are the genitals and what are the chromosomes that you're born with? But we know that that is not even biologically something that is binary, right? We have a lot of differences throughout our chromosomes that can be not just X and Y or XX. You know, there is a community of intersex people, right? People who don't fit the biological definition that doctors throughout history have decided is some static idea of what biology is. So we can consider assigned sex, or what we're now referring to as socialized as, right? So I was socialized as a female, but I'm not female, right? And so how does my assigned sex or the way I was socialized differ from my actual gender identity, which is the internal sense of who I am, right? Gender is so much bigger and more complicated than what are your parts, right? I think assigning people an identity based on the parts that they're born with that we really don't even fully understand medically, because we can't see inside everyone's body, right? We can't see inside of people's chromosomes unless we're doing obviously detailed testing on them, but still there's a variety and a range of things. But gender identity and what you feel innately is also so varied. You know, gender includes gender roles, which are the societal expectations that people have about the behaviors and thoughts and characteristics that go along with what we're perceiving typically to be a binary male and female. And I think part of what LGBTQ plus liberation is getting at is that we're so much more than that. We're so much more than these two things. And that I understand it's very easy to confuse assigned sex or the sex that someone was socialized as with their gender. But I think the best way to confirm these things are for people to tell you, right? Not everyone's going to tell you, and that's okay. They don't owe that to you. But if someone does tell you what their gender is, then it's important for you to respect and honor that. And people might express their gender in a variety of ways, right? We all have ways in which we have clothing, hairstyle, body language, and voice, but that doesn't mean that because someone presents more masculine or more feminine in a stereotypical way in which we've been socialized to believe that that is their gender identity. You know, there's much more to people than what you are seeing or what people are even able to control. And we'll get into medical transition, but essentially gender expression is what someone feels comfortable in exhibiting what they believe their gender identity to be. So sexual orientation is completely different than gender identity. So sexual orientation is the diverse range of emotional, romantic, and sexual feelings that people have. It's about who you're drawn to, right? Romantically, emotionally. It's about who you're attracted to and not about who you are, which is what your gender identity is. So heterosexual or straight is people who are attracted to a different gender. Gay or lesbian are people who are attracted to the same gender. But I don't want you even to think that that is the end of the nuance there, right? Because there are non-binary lesbians, right? There are people who were either socialized as women or who transitioned to be you know, feminine, but still identify as non-binary, but also identify as a lesbian. So those things are not mutually exclusive. But traditionally, the lesbian community were women that are attracted to women, and the gay community were men that were attracted to men. But there's still obviously nuance as sexual orientation evolves. But bisexual, pansexual, or queer means a variety of sexual orientations that are anything other basically than straight and cisgender, right? In the past, the word queer was used as a slur to hurt and insult people, and some people may still find it offensive, particularly people who were involved in the beginning of the gay liberation movement in the 60s and 70s, right? As we call them in the community, our queer elders, right? So they may not want to use that word. Others now use the word with pride to identify themselves, right? I identify as queer. I think sometimes the reason that people want to get away from the word sexual in the queer identity is because it's so much more than who you're having sex with, right? It's about an identity that's about community, that's about who you're experiencing a deep connection with, that doesn't necessarily really involve sexual feelings all the time, or is just so much broader than that. But those are still words that can and should be used if someone identifies that way. Questioning or curious. So people that are unsure about their sexual orientation, right? Not everyone comes to the queer community out of the gate knowing who they are, knowing who they're attracted to. We all kind of have to develop into a sense of ourselves. So there are often times in people's lives when they're not completely sure about their sexual orientation, and things can be fluid. I think that's something that the queer community celebrates, is the fluidity of sexual orientation. And then finally is the asexual spectrum. So the asexual spectrum is also just as complicated as the queer spectrum. You know, asexual people can experience a variety of sexual and romantic attraction and have varying levels of attraction to other people, right? There's aromantic people, there's asexual people, there's gray romantic people, all people who experience different levels of maybe not having what we would consider the normative level of sexual and romantic attraction to people, but are still very much a valid part of the queer community, and important for us to consider as well, that, you know, people, not everyone experiences what we identify in Western American culture to be, you know, romance and sexuality in the kind of way that we know it to be. And a term for that community too, for short, is called the ACE community. So thinking beyond the binary, right? So the term cisgender relates to anyone whose gender identity aligns with the sex that they were assigned at birth or socialized to be in childhood and adulthood, right? Anyone who's not trans. Transgender people are people whose gender identity differs from what they were socialized as. So some societies, like Western American society, tend to recognize just two genders as male and female. But the transgender community has broadened our idea of what that means, right? Many trans people are coming to know themselves as non-binary, as gender fluid, as gender queer, as polygender, bigender, demigender, or agender. So these are all identities that fall under the trans umbrella, right? That are similar identities, but are not necessarily interchangeable, right? If I identify as non-binary, that doesn't mean that I also identify as all these other terms. And non-binary is kind of a buzzword lately. I think that people have been hearing it a lot more lately, and I think that's really great. But I think it also has kind of become synonymous with a third gender, and I don't think that's what we want people to think of as the trans and queer community, right? Non-binary and gender fluid, gender queer, polygender, these are not terms that are just a third gender, right? It means having such a broad scope of what gender can be, and such a, you know, wonderful expression of things that are beyond just male and female. And people can float between identities, and they can float between masculinity and femininity, or outside of the realm of gender altogether. The term intersex, as I explained previously, is when you're born with reproductive or sexual anatomy that doesn't fit kind of the colloquial assumption of modern medicine, or really historical medicine, of what it means to be a male or female. It's a naturally occurring variation. It's more common than you think about. It's more common than people with red hair, right? About 1 to 2 out of 100 people in America are born intersex. And I think as we come to expand our beliefs and cultural knowledge about the queer and trans community, we will also expand the scientific base of what we know to be gender, right? Because science is not always based specifically in factual realities, but it's also considered by people who are bringing the science to the table, right? Whose perspective is that? So as we learn more, we know that intersex variations within our population, biologically, male and female, are very varying. And I think without getting into a lot of the trans sports bills that we're seeing in America right now, we will come to see that a lot of the genetic testing that is being done on athletes that consider themselves cisgender will show a variation of hormones, of chromosomes, of abilities of people that are not assumed in science right now, right? Like, many women who compete in sports have a higher level naturally of testosterone than what sports communities and like the Olympic committees are considering when they're making these rules. And I believe historically, when these types of rules were made for trans athletes, many cisgender women are being discriminated against as well, based on their biological characteristics. So that's just something to consider. And then finally, Two-Spirit is a term created by First Nations, Native American, and Indigenous people who have sexual orientation or gender identity that exists in ways that challenge colonial structures of a gender binary, right? So it's important always to recognize that our Indigenous and Native communities and Black and Brown communities have always had a broad range of gender identity and sexual orientation that's not been considered in Western society, right? Colonialism has oppressed the ideas that have been vibrant in these communities, that gender is so much broader than male and female, and that the expression of Indigenous, Native American, and Black and Brown cultures have always been more expansive than anything that Western colonization has brought to our world. So the word Two-Spirit is specifically for those communities, and something that we need to consider and honor. So like I talked about previously, your gender expression is the way in which you are hoping to present yourself to the world based on your physical appearance, clothing, hairstyle, and behavior, right? But that doesn't always match up, I've found a lot in my experience, with what other people perceive your gender to be. You can't always control how high your voice is, how your mannerisms come off towards people, but the perceived gender that other people have on you is something that you can't control, right? So I think it's important to consider that we cannot see someone's sex or gender when we look at them, that we should not just assume someone's pronouns, someone's identity based on a brief interaction or introduction to them, or even historically how we have known them, right? When people tell you who they are, that's who they are. It's not based on what your experience of someone is. It's based on what their experience and their lived experience is. So, pronouns.
Sorry, if I could just interrupt. This is Kelly. I'm going to launch the first of the poll questions now. You'll have 2 minutes to respond. Attorneys, you need to respond to this. And the second question that'll be coming up later in order to receive CLE credit. And thank you. Please feel free to continue.
Thanks, Kelly. So pronouns, names and pronouns are the best way in our interactions with clients, with other people in the legal community to communicate with our clients and to communicate about our own gender. So honoring a person's name and pronouns shows respect and acknowledgement of their gender and identity, right? So for our legal purposes, there might be some times where you need to know someone's legal name, but it is important that we ask them what their preferred name is and that we use their preferred name. And we can't assume someone's pronouns. When we're doing intake, you know, it's important to ask people what their pronouns are, and maybe notate that in your intake notes or in any type of case notes that you have, so that you can remember, and also you can pass that on without, you know, constantly having to re-ask someone their pronouns, right? Just make sure that your intake or when you're getting a new case that you're confirming with a person what their name and their pronouns are, even if that's not what's on their legal documents, maybe that's not what the court has referred to them as. It's important that you as an attorney or a paralegal or any other staff member make sure that you're using what people prefer as their pronouns and their name. And some people use multiple sets of pronouns, right? People can use all three sets of traditionally known pronouns, but there also are what's called neo-pronouns, right? So neo-pronouns are also ancient. They're not new. People have been using neo-pronouns for centuries. And every pronoun that I've listed here is not an exhaustive list of what people's pronouns or neo-pronouns are, right? Typically we hear she, her, hers, he, him, his, and now we've heard they, them, theirs a lot. But there are some common other neo-pronouns that I've listed here. Z, here, and here's, and here, self. Z, them, their, and theirs, and themself. And then they, their, this, and their self. I had to honestly look these up to remember the correct pronunciation. I follow a really cool attorney on Instagram at transcendthebinary_, and they have a lot of great videos about neo-pronouns, about non-binary and gender neutral terms to use for people, right? I think that's something that we need to consider more and more. How are we referring to people in groups? How are we referring to people in family settings? You know, what are we referring to people as, and how can we degender our terms in the legal community, but also in socialization as generally, right? You know, what are we considering non-binary and other gender non-conforming folks? What's the language that we're using, and how can we improve on that? And I think even as a non-binary person myself, you know, it's difficult to think about what am I calling myself in certain situations, right? We don't in America have this language, right? Other cultures, other indigenous, Black and brown cultures, they have words for these, right? But because we've been so colonized in America, we don't necessarily have the language to catch up with that. So honorifics. Honorific just basically is a respectful form of title or address, right? Mr., Mrs. were common. And then in the 1980s, Ms. became a common name for women, regardless of marital status or age, and was something that we used in place of Miss or Mrs. Now there are a lot of different terms that you can use for non-binary or genderqueer, gender fluid people. Mix is one of them. That's the honorific that I go by, but there's also VIX, VX. There's also SAI, SAI, or MER, MER. Those are all gender neutral options. Again, you might not come across these as much as, you know, commonly used ones as Mr. and Ms., but it's important to ask somebody as well, not only what their pronouns and their preferred name is, but what's their honorific, right? I put my honorific and my pronouns in every single email I ever send. It doesn't always get through to people, but it helps. And to make sure that on an intake form that you're confirming with the person that you're addressing that. So one of the biggest things that we can do as legal professionals is just to announce your pronouns when meeting someone. I went to the doctor's the other day and the medical intern said my pronouns are she, her, which obviously opened the door up for me to say mine are they, them, right? That's the best way that you can open the door, is just by announcing your pronouns. And especially as someone who identifies as cisgender, it's so critical for you to do that, because it is announcing basically a safe space to queer and trans people. Like I said, put them in your email, put them on your business cards. I have a little plaque in my office, anywhere that you can display your pronouns and make it commonplace for people to share themselves with you. I think that's the best practice that we can have. And also refrain from sharing anyone else's story for them without explicit permission, right? Not everyone feels comfortable, like I said, in different settings, coming out, right? Not everyone feels safe in different situations, right? So it can happen. If you know that your client is trans and they don't want you to share that with anyone else, then obviously anytime that someone tells you something important about themselves, you want to honor that and say thank you for sharing that with me. I'm glad you feel safe sharing that with me. Please let me know when and how you would like me to let other people know this, or if you're uncomfortable with that, your intake forms should include whether you should use that person's pronouns in court or other settings. A lot of times, working with child clients, they may not always want their parents to know about their gender identity. There obviously could be situations in which we're representing children and we need to be careful about revealing those things to their parents. I know there's been legislation, specifically in Florida, as I'm sure we all know, requiring teachers to tell parents. And that's also not something that we as legal professionals want to get into, is outing children or clients in situations where they don't feel safe. So this is the ABA's 5 tips for LGBTQ plus representation. So never use outdated terminology, right? Sexual preference, homosexual, hermaphrodite, transsexual. These are outdated terms. Obviously, I use them in the history of Pride because those were the terms at the time. And the last time I presented this presentation, someone asked me, why don't we use the term homosexual anymore? And I don't think I had the best answer. But after some research, it's because the terms homosexual, hermaphrodite, transsexual are highly clinicalized terms by the medical community specifically, that have created mental illness categories for those terms, right? So people were classified as homosexual and transsexual, and that was a deviance that needed to be corrected because they were mentally ill. And it also is a sexualization of the queer identity that really doesn't fit the community anymore, right? Especially with the trans and gay bills, anti-trans and anti-gay bills that we're seeing throughout America now, that these terms are being used to weaponize the identities of queer and trans people to be deviant, to try to compare it to pedophilia, that type of thing. So to try and kind of shift the focus away from that and to say that sexual orientation is not deviant, it's not a mental illness, it's not related to pedophilia, it's not related to these concepts that a lot of people have tried to demonize the LGBTQ plus community for. So that's why it's important that we recognize outdated terms, right? And that we consider the language that we're using, and people will tell you what their preferred terms are. And if they're using outdated terms, I'm not saying you shouldn't use those terms for whoever tells you that, but in general, try to avoid phrases like this because it can be obviously outdated and it can be, a microaggression. So try and revise all of your internal forms and documents to be culturally sensitive, right? I know that we're doing a lot of family law at Legal Aids, right? So to consider using the term spouse and spouse or parent or child instead of my daughter, their son, etc. Because we don't know how that child identifies. We don't know how that person identifies. If someone tells you their gender identity, that's fine. But to try to make all of your documents as gender neutral as possible, I know that that would make things a lot easier for the LGBTQ plus community to interact with us. And again, don't assume that if it's not clear, if you're confused, politely ask for clarification, right? What would you like to be called? What is your preferred gender identity? What is your pronouns? What is your name, right? Do not out clients, as I said before, if you don't have permission, specifically in pleadings or court proceedings. Make sure that your staff are trained in cultural competency, right? Have they seen presentations like this? Have you spoken with them about proper terminology and proper ways to interact with the LGBTQ plus community? And then prepare for possible bias from the court. I had a friend recently who went to a name change in Pittsburgh, and her lawyer informed her ahead of time, listen, the court staff is going to dead name you. I'm just trying to warn you in advance that they're going to use the wrong name for you, and you should just prepare in advance. Obviously, it's not an ideal situation that the court during transgender name change day is dead naming people, but it's important that if we know that the court has a certain bias, or that we know that it's not safe to use your pronouns, it's not safe to come out to this court, or a lot of times there has to be a certain advocacy in the courtroom. I've experienced situations where my client was being targeted in juvenile court as a parent for expressing gender nonconforming attributes. And I had to bring that up with the court, right? That this is not appropriate for the opposing party to do that. I've had to withdraw on cases where my client did not want their child to go with a queer couple as a foster parent, right? I've had to use this rule in court to say, this is a repugnant position and it is against the rules of professional responsibility, and I will not be a part of it, and I will not represent this person anymore. And that was obviously my personal choice, but I would encourage all of us when we're in court to not sit idly by if the court or if other parties or other lawyers are not engaging in this rule of professional responsibility, to ask them to rise to that level, because that's what the Supreme Court expects of us, and that is what our community deserves. So, trans affirming conversations. Trans people, like I said, we're not a monolith. Transitioning is intensely personal, and it doesn't look the same for everyone. When I was going through my medical transition, I tried to let the court know ahead of time and let other attorneys in the community know ahead of time. And I got a lot of questions like, are you going to do the full transition, right? But there is no full transition. The transition is over when a trans person says that they are done transitioning, or, sometimes transition never stops, right? And it doesn't always mean the same thing to every person. It's related to your personal expression, right? It's not just a surgery. It's not just taking hormones. It's not just changing your name. It's not all of these things that we consider to be transition are not the same for everyone. Let me just go back. So there are a few ways that we can transition. Transitioning medically means that you're getting some type of surgery. There are over 14 gender affirming surgeries that people can go through. There's hormone therapy, gender affirming hormone therapy, that can be taking testosterone or taking estrogen in a variety of forms. Testosterone can come in shots, it can come in gel. Estrogen can come in the form of traditional birth control pills. It can also come in the form of a shot. There's a new medical technology that we can, I mean, it's not new, but people have been low dosing hormones, which is a way to slowly transition, right? There's a lot of nuance in the way that trans people are using gender affirming healthcare to make it so that they can transition in a way that feels the best to them and the best to their bodies. Social transitioning is using maybe new pronouns, a new name. It can be wearing new clothes, it can be a haircut, it can be anything that you can express about yourself can be a social transition. And then a legal transition, right? We come in to play a lot of the times helping people change their names, helping people change their driver's license, their social security, things of that nature is how you can also transition. And trans people don't always have access to the same things that other people do, right? As a white lawyer, I have a lot of access. I have had access to a gender affirming surgery that some people might not have access. And it's not anyone's place to ask people about their transition, right? What do you plan to do to transition? You know, that's something between a person's doctor and themselves, right? So, but when people are coming to us for legal help to legally transition, there are a lot of ways in which we can assist them in an affirming way. So under no circumstances should you ask unprompted questions about someone's medical history, genitals, body, plans for procedures. Like I said, you know, I've been through that so many times. Don't ask them their dead name. That's a term in the trans community to mean that's their previous name or the name that they were born with. Don't ask them invasive details about what it was like to be a girl or what it was like to be a boy. Things like that, right? That can be very triggering for people. You know, obviously don't say a lot of these phrases, right? They are a transgender, right? A transgender is not a thing. Transgender is an adjective, right? It describes me. It's not who I am as a noun. What were you born as, right? You don't need to know what somebody was assigned at birth. What's your real name, birth name? These are things you don't need to know unless you're helping somebody with a name change, honestly. Unless you need that information for important documents, you don't need to know someone's prior name. Did you get the surgery, right? There's so many different surgeries and medical interventions that trans people can go through, but they also don't owe you an explanation on what they are. Same with, are you going to do the whole transition? Are you going to start hormones, right? Gender affirming hormone treatment is not a prerequisite for transitioning. A lot of trans people don't use hormones. A lot of people do. Some people start them, stop them, start them again. It's none of your business. And then when did you decide or choose to be trans, right? It's not a choice or a decision. You make the choice to start doing these medical, legal, or social transitions, but it's an identity. It's not something that you can choose. And I got all of these questions also from an activist, Skylar Baylor, on Instagram. He was the first NCAA trans athlete swimming. That's also a big deal right now in the community. Is the FINA had announced recently that they're not going to allow girls who did not transition before the age of 12 to compete in different swimming associations. So I really like Skylar's content. If you ever have any questions as well on, you know, trans activism and things that trans people are experiencing. So what to do if you make a mistake, right? People make mistakes a lot. I understand. It can be confusing or just difficult if you've known somebody for a really long time as a certain name or certain pronouns, but it's important to make a conscious effort, whether that person's in front of you or not, to correctly gender someone, to use their correct name, to affirm their identity. Whether you misgender somebody on accident or it's a malicious attempt, or, you know, it shows that person that you are not thinking about them and you are not taking accountability and making an effort to use the pronouns that affirm them, right? It's deeply hurtful. And if you're using pronouns, you know, that are outdated for somebody, then it can also out them, you know, in an environment that's not tolerant, right? If somebody transitioned and they don't want people to know that they transitioned, and you use their different pronouns, that can be very dangerous for them. Like I said, purposefully misgendering is not okay. And you can be an ally by standing up for your clients, for other lawyers, for the judiciary, if you witness someone being harassed for their gender, or even if it's you see somebody else making a mistake, or you hear somebody else make a mistake, you can just say, her, it's actually he. They go by them. You know, it doesn't have to be a big thing, but speaking up for somebody's pronouns or their identity, you know, their sexual orientation, I don't know if that really comes into play a lot, but pronouns is definitely an easy way that you can make your office and our community as legal professionals more inclusive. And if you apologize, or if you misgender somebody, you can apologize swiftly without making a big show of it. I honestly prefer that people don't apologize. It's very awkward when people apologize because it puts the onus on the person who's been misgendered to accept that apology. It's easiest to just, you know, maybe as a rule of thumb, for every time you misgender somebody, use their correct gender 3 times, right? Ingrain that into your brain to reroute the way that you're thinking about that person. And also to consider that memorizing somebody's pronouns also isn't the same as accepting and understanding the fullness of somebody's gender identity, right? Just because you memorize somebody's pronouns doesn't mean that you're really respecting that person. You know, it's important to think about somebody's gender identity as more than just pronouns, but pronouns are obviously an important way that we can show people that we understand and respect who they are. So
I'm sorry, if I could just launch the second poll question here. For attorneys, this is the second poll question for CLE credit. You'll have 2 minutes to respond. Thank you. And go ahead, Abby. Thank you.
Like I said, if you forget, just do your best to correct yourself. It's good to think about what you're going to do if you do make a mistake, right? So this is what the Trevor Project recommends. Listen, right? So if somebody tells you that's not the right pronouns for me, or that's not my identity, or you've said something that upset me or offended me, listen, right? Don't make it about you. Don't make it about how you're doing your best and it's just really difficult. And, you know, I'm so used to using these he, she pronouns, you know, and take responsibility for your actions, the privileges you might experience it as a straight or cisgender person, and the experiences that led you to make this mistake, right? Don't dismiss that you made a mistake. Don't try to justify your behavior. Don't defend your intentions. Intention is not impact, right? The way that we intend things to happen is usually not the way that people receive them. And the best apology is one that doesn't make excuses or gaslight or invalidate the other person and their experience. And then commit to do better, right? Like I said, if you misgender someone once, maybe try to commit to using their correct pronouns 3 times throughout the day correctly, or just make a better effort next time. So I believe that is the end. I will address any questions if anybody has them in the next 5 minutes.
If you don't want to type in the chat box questions or comments, feel free to unmute yourselves.
Yeah, and I'm happy to, if you want to shoot me an email. I know sometimes asking these questions can be a little bit difficult to ask in public. I can put my email in the chat as well. All right, I think that's it. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you. Take care. Thanks, Abby.